For 30 years, well, over 30 years, I've made a career of preventing the major causes of death and disability. And diet is by far the most important way to do that. Now, given that perspective and background, you're probably going to be surprised to hear me say, here are the biggest mistakes. I'm going to do a brief series on the three most common diet mistakes. None of them have to do with food choice. I know that sounds weird, but let's go a little bit further and you'll see why. Now, how did I come up with these again? My experience as a doc, I taught prevention at one of the world's leading medical universities. I've got experience with hundreds or actually thousands of patients um, and supervision of hundreds and again, even thousands of docs. I can tell you, for example, that internists know a lot of the stuff that we're getting ready to talk about, but in the day-to-day drill of what they do, they tend to forget about it and they tend to get focused more on the standards rather than what's best for prevention for every patient. ER docs often don't even know about it. Many other docs don't know about it either. Family practitioners are sort of halfway in between the two. But let's not even worry about the docs so much. Let's talk about the diets. Let me start by saying I'm not talking about plant-based. Um, I know plant-based, and oh my Lord, there is so much heat, maybe more heat than light on this debate. This is a book by a Jennifer Marshall on the plant-based diet. Um, and so I think a lot of you would look at that and say, oh, look at that tortilla shell. That's got a lot of grease. She could theoretically call that plant-based, but that's really bad because that's processed food. Well, maybe it's not even processed food. She's saying here in her own title that it's whole foods. But again, this is not that. I don't think this is the most common error with a diet. Other folks would say, okay, really, it's carbs is a big, big issue, and it's really stop only sugar. There's a book called SOS, Stop Only Sugar, and they're focused on getting out the bad carbs, the simple carbs, low in fiber and nutrients, white bread, sugar, brown sugar, either brown or white, fruit juices, white rice, muffins, candy, cookies, pretzels, sugary cereals, a big killer. Um, and replace that with whole grain bread, brown rice, beans, nuts, seeds, oatmeal. I, I think those are valid points. But as I said, I don't think they're the major dietary mistake that I tend to see. I don't even think they hit the top three. And again, this may sound weird. Let's go on and talk a little bit about some things that I don't think it is. There's just, again, talk about emotion. You've got a lot of paleo folks out there who say paleo's the way to go. And this book is 300 delicious paleo diet recipes. I think paleo has a lot to go for it, just like uh, picking the right kind of carbs if and when you're eating carbs. Um, but I don't think that it's paleo versus non-paleo. That's clearly not the most common error. Well, then there's clean eating. Now, I've studied what the people that came up with the term clean eating. Um, I used to know what it means, but the reality is, even when I knew what it meant, I didn't know what it meant. Clean eating. My grandma used to say, well, a food is no longer clean if it touches the floor. Well, I don't think that's what Emma Cady's talking about in this book, and I don't think that's what the founders of the recent fad and focus on, quote, clean eating meant either. And I still don't think those are the number one causes of, or problems with diet. Then there's this thing about processed food. And I think once we all get tired of having these debates about low carb, high fat versus high fat, low carb, no, versus high carb, low fat, and all of the macronutrient debates, and plant-based versus animal-based, people quite often will go back and they'll make what I think is also a valid point: unprocessed foods. But you know what? I still would tell you, I don't think eating processed foods is the major dietary problem I see out there. Same thing with this. You know, this book is about 75 of the best carbs, proteins, and fats. How to find them. Again, as you see on this picture, it looks to be focused on unprocessed foods. Again, I think very laudable, very plausible, very important, but not the number one issue. Ketosis. How does ketosis work? Again, you know, once you start getting into that whole argument about how much carbs versus fat, you start getting into the whole discussion of keto diet, the higher fat diet versus a higher carb diet. Again, a lot to be said for that. So I've spent a lot of time talking about what it's not. I will say this, pardon the bad image here. As you know, I'm notorious for having bad images in my videos. This is the cover of a book by Brad Bale and Amy Doneen. Why am I covering that at this point? Theirs is not a diet book. They don't really talk that much about diets. They talk about cardiovascular inflammation and cardiovascular inflammation as the major cause of heart attack and stroke. They also talk about insulin resistance as by far the major cause of cardiovascular inflammation. And I think they're right about that. In fact, I mean, look at the research. I know it's they get really focused on cardiovascular inflammation. In fact, just sort of mention insulin resistance. They cover it in a couple of areas, but they really, I'd love to see them emphasize insulin resistance more. What is insulin resistance? Prediabetes. It's the inability to manage sugar in a healthy way. Now, wait a minute. Did I just take a big digression from diet, the best diet, into insulin resistance? Yes, I did. Now, why would I do that? Well, as I said, I don't think it's dietary choices. I think it's approaching your diet being totally unaware that you have insulin resistance. And so, as you can see from this headline, now you can say, well, I'm a right coast person, not a left coast person. I'm not into, you know, those guys are kooks in LA and UCLA is located there, so they can't be right. They're right. This has gone through journal judging. This is correct. Their estimate is 55% of Californian adults, 30 and older, have prediabetes. Now, this is not new research. This actually came out in 2016. John's already done a video on this actual, this article. Unfortunately, people just aren't getting it. They're not looking. We've had like 200 views on that video. It's frustrating that people are not listening. Prediabetes is higher among adults of color, Pacific Islanders, American Indians, African Americans, higher rates of prediabetes. But why talk about it and look at images? Why don't we just look at the actual numbers that they saw in this UCLA study? Okay, 18 to 39, a third or more, depending on your ethnic group, had insulin resistance, and a third overall for the state of California. How about 40 and above? 49%. So these are prediabetes rates. How about 55 to 69? 60%. And then it goes back down, maybe a percentage, maybe that's not significant, 70 and above. Now, what's interesting about these numbers is this. They were developed looking only at hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose. Again, let's go back and let me reemphasize why I made that right turn and started talking about insulin resistance. I have patient after patient come to me and say, um, I don't know what's causing my plaque. I don't know what's causing my heart attack and stroke risk. And you've seen this. John shared this on his videos a couple of times. When John Lorscheider, as much as he knows about heart attack and stroke risk, I remember the first time he and I met. I went there, started asking about it, and he said with a lot of confidence, well, you can look at sugar problems, diabetes, prediabetes, but I don't have it. We check it every year. My docs have looked at it every year, and I've encouraged them to do so. I know that's a major cause, but I don't have it. And I said, okay, but would you humor me and maybe get a couple of tests? And he agreed. Well, the first thing we did was something that, again, Brad Bale and Amy Deneen recommend, OGTT, oral glucose tolerance test. That's where you go NPO, or nothing by mouth. You fast for at least 8 hours. Then you take a glucose challenge. You get your blood sugar before then at 30 minutes, 1 hour, and 2 hours after taking the glucose. And why would they recommend that? Because this number is conservative compared to what you see with OGTT. In other words, if you actually do the test where you challenge people with glucose, you'll see that these numbers are actually low. But here's the other thing. Those numbers are actually low as well. If you look at fasting glucose, fasting insulin, you'll see that even the OGTT numbers are low. This is a book called The Diabetes Epidemic in You. Should everyone be tested? Absolutely not. Only those concerned about their future. This was by Joseph Kraft. He was a pathologist that wrote this book, and you can argue with his style of writing, but you can't really argue that much with his results. They saw levels 75, 80% or more, depending on the age group, of insulin resistance. Now, is that actually? I have heard people argue with the results and the test itself. John again shared in one of his videos that he went back and took this his Kraft insulin survey to his doc, and his doc said, well, those are geared to fail. Well, here's the thing. I guess you could say that. But here's what we found with John's, and again, he shared it before. OGTT was actually normal for John, but as we did the Kraft insulin survey, there's a similar one called Hayashi, Hayashhi. And that showed that he had what's often called a pattern 3 or 4 with Kraft or Hayashi, and that is you peak on your glucose numbers after the second hour. And sure enough, as John said, he got way over 200, close to 300, and maybe 300 at hours 2, 3, or 4. So what does that mean? Well, that means that whenever John was getting over a certain amount of carbs in his diet, not just from the time he had the test, but in his diet, on a regular basis, he was going up to way over 200 for his blood sugar and staying there for hours. In fact, the pattern 3 and 4 appears to be people that miss that first phase of release of stored insulin and are waiting for their pancreas to make insulin de novo. That's, if you don't get that, don't worry about that. Just worry about this issue. The vast majority of people that come to see me, their major dietary problem is they don't know that they have insulin resistance, prediabetes, or even full-blown diabetes. So therefore, that knowledge makes all the difference in the world. Again, as you've seen through a couple of John's videos, you've seen through my videos. Once you know that your blood sugars are going up to damaging levels after you eat, it gives you a whole different perspective, a whole different framework for this is how I'm eating and this is what I should do. Now, there are other ways to check for insulin resistance and check for this problem. One of them, for example, is fasting insulin versus hemoglobin A1C. Are we getting it right? This was from a CME type journal called Clinical Advisor. The reality is there is a major place for getting fasting insulin levels. You could get that, but again, with the Kraft Insulin Survey, you get a fasting insulin level and you get insulin levels after your glucose challenge. So diabetes care. This is, I mentioned a fellow named Hayashi, Tomishogi Hayashi. His name is also put together with Dr. Kraft's in terms of looking at OGTT patterns, oral glucose tolerance patterns, and predicting the risk of type 2 diabetes. So again, this it started off in terms of maybe being very simple, very non-clinical, but as usual, I got fairly clinical at the end. And here's the issue. It's not which diet you take. It's not paleo versus clean versus plant versus animal. It's not knowing that you're not metabolizing one of the top three, or one of the three macronutrients. And in fact, knowing that one of those macronutrients, carbohydrates, is causing damage to the intimal lining of your artery. It's not knowing that is by far, in my mind, the major error that folks are making in their diet. I've just gotten through one. I'm going to be covering two other major errors in diets, but we'll do that in parts 2 and 3. Thank you for your interest.